We have been on a journey for the last, actually it's a year and 8 months, or will be as we conclude the month of December, through the book of Mark. And we're at a place in Mark chapter 14 where Jesus is on his way to the cross. And we're looking at the final hours of the life of Jesus. The book of Mark is the shortest of all the Gospels. Matthew, I think it's 28 chapters. Mark has 16. Luke has some 24, and I think John has 21. I guess I should have looked that up. But it is the shortest of all the gospel accounts. And really 1/3 of the book of Mark describes 1 week in the life of Jesus. So this is so important. As we move through the Christmas season, it's just amazing to me how, looking ahead, that as Christmas, how fitting it is for us to be at this place in Mark. I don't know of a better way to think and approach the Christmas season than to think about the cross and the empty tomb, and to think about the purpose of what Christmas is all about. That Jesus came and he was born, certainly. We celebrate his birth at Christmas. But he came for a purpose and for a reason, and that purpose was to die on the cross, to pay the penalty and the price for our sin. As Jesus, in this last hours of his life, he is there in the upper room with his disciples. He makes the journey from there, and he moves down out of the city, through the city gates, down from the Temple Mount, and he goes up into the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, and there he arrives at the Garden of Gethsemane. And as you think about that, as Jesus spends about 4 hours there in the Garden of Gethsemane in prayer over what's going to take place, then the mob comes, and a little after midnight he is arrested, and he's carried back into Jerusalem, and he stands before the Sanhedrin at a mock trial at the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. And then from that roughness and from that accusation and from that false trial and that mockery of a trial, he is carried before Herod, and then to Pilate, and then to Herod, and then back to Pilate. And that process, through all of that, takes about 5 hours. And then he is brutally beaten beyond the recognition of a man. And he is placed upon his shoulders as the cross that he carries through the streets of Jerusalem. And there he is taken to the place of Golgotha, the place of the skull. And he's nailed there on the cross. And he spends 6 hours there on the cross, dying on the cross, before he is taken and placed in an empty tomb. As you think about these last hours of Jesus' life, and today we're going to trace from the upper room that he moves into the Garden of Gethsemane. He would have had to come to the bottom and cross a little, it's called the Kidron Brook, and we would call it no more than a creek. It's just a very narrow body of water. And the Hebrew people never drank out of Brook Kidron, because the blood that ran from the Temple Mount drained down into that brook. And to think, as Jesus stepped across, it would have been a full moon, because it was Passover, and he would have seen those dark, bloody waters of Kidron, and would have gone through his mind as he made his way into the Mount of Olives, that his blood would stain the ground in just a few short hours. And that's where we are as we come to Mark chapter 14, and beginning in verse 32. And they came to a place named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here until I have prayed." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be very distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch." And went a little beyond them, and fell to the ground, and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. And he was saying, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Keep watch and praying, that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away, and he prayed, saying the same words. And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. Geographically, we know where this took place, the Mount of Olives. Olive trees don't really grow much taller after maturity, but they get wider, they sprout new roots, and new shoots run up. And there in the Garden of Gethsemane, there on the Mount of Olives, there are ancient, massive olive trees. I do not believe that this is an accident. This is coincidence that Jesus prays at this place. There on the Mount of Olives, there is a church that has been built. It's called the Church of All Nations. And as you go into that church, and there is a 10 by 10 rocky ledge that is there, and that is called the Rock of Agony. I've been to that spot. They believe that we certainly know where the Mount of Olives historically, geographically is. They believe that this is likely the very spot that Jesus prayed these prayers on this night. I've knelt there at that rock, and I've prayed, and you just cannot help but be overwhelmed in emotions to think that this is the place where Jesus prayed this prayer and all that he endured. And as you stop and you think that, I invite you to go to the garden with me today. And I invite you to try to comprehend spiritually what Jesus experienced here. Now, we can look at this intellectually and try to understand some things intellectually, but this involves an emotional expression as it did for Jesus. And so I want us to think about 3 emotional expressions that Jesus probably experienced. And the first one, they named that the Rock of Agony. I think that is probably a good description that Jesus at this place, in this time, experienced agony. And I want us to think just a little bit about that. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's at the Mount of Olives. This is a place where is associated with production of olive and all that meant in that world. Just as Jesus had in the upper room had taken a tradition that was for the Jewish people and had been handed down through generation for thousands of years to understand the Passover and look back, that Jesus observed the last Passover meal with them, and then he instituted what we know as the Lord's Supper. And there he gives us elements to remember and try to help us understand what he did, that his body was broken, that his blood was shed for us. Well, I think the same thing is true here at the Mount of Olives. The olive tree in ancient world was called by many the tree of life, because it's so much about the olive tree, and olives was used in their daily life. They would use it for oil for cooking and for eating. They would take the oil and they would use it as fuel in their lamps to give light. They would take the products of the olive oil and they would use it to mix and use as medicine. It had a medicinal purpose served for us. And I think as you look there at the Mount of Olives and what takes place here in the Garden of Gethsemane, that it gives us an understanding. They didn't pick olives. You don't pick olives. They put down claws, and then they would take sticks and violently beat the limbs until the olives fell from the tree. And it is a reminder to me the agony that Jesus would go through of the cross. As they would take olives are crushed 3 times. You don't glean the full benefit of an olive until it has been crushed. And I think that's the lesson God is trying to teach us. First of all, they would take the olives and they would put it in a meal, and they would take a huge millstone that would roll around in a trough. It would either be powered by human propulsion or by a beast of burden as it would go around. And then as the olives were crushed, they would secrete the oil, and that oil would be drained off. That was the clear, the purest oil. That was the extra virgin olive oil, and they would take that, and of course that was of great value to them. But then the olives would be crushed a second time. They would take those olives then and they would put them in bags similar to cheesecloth. And then they would place those under a press, and either it was a screw press or they would just pile huge stones, and just from the weight of that, they would crush the olives again as that oil came out, and they would harvest that. And then they weren't through. After they had drained all the olive oil out, then they would then take those stones out or release the pressure, and they would pour hot water over those bags, and then they would crush the third time. And then as the byproduct of that ran off, then they would catch that in a reservoir, let it settle, and as the oil would come to the top, they would skim that oil off and use that oil. And then even that byproduct, that water byproduct, they would even take that and boil it down and either use it as axle grease, or they would pour it over a road or a pathway, and as it dried, then it would just form a hard shell over that. Then they would take the pulp that was left, and they would feed it to sickly animals because it had such a high mineral salt content. And so everything about the olive, the point that I'm trying to make is that as you think about the olive, you think about its benefit whenever it is crushed, and it is crushed until nothing is left. That is what the Garden of Gethsemane teaches us. That Jesus came, and I don't think it's a coincidence that he came 3 different times and asked his disciples to wait up and to pray and to watch, and that he was crushed. Whenever you hear these words and you think about what Jesus in this crushing, in this time of what Jesus experienced, Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7 says, in the days of his flesh he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. You think about as Jesus there in that time of great agony, as he's there in that time of great agony. That the Bible gives us an account, and Luke tells us the detail that Mark leaves out, but Luke says, Luke's a medical doctor, so this would have been probably of great interest to him. Luke chapter 22 and verse 44, it says, and being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. There's a medical condition called hematidrosis. It's a condition where the capillaries around sweat glands rupture, and they'll exude blood into the sweat glands, so that when that person sweats, that he literally sweats great drops of blood. This is, of course, the most famous example of that. The second most famous case of that, or noted case, is King Charles IX, who was a French monarch. He was Roman Catholic, and he ordered the St. Bartholomew Days massacre, where 10,000 Protestants were slaughtered. And such guilt from what he had ordered that it drove him mad. It drove him insane. And one of the physical conditions that were present whenever he died was hematidrosis, where he, in medical condition that is caused here, is because of such great emotional stress that the body just breaks down. And that's what happens whenever you read here what Jesus went through. There is an emotional trauma that Jesus goes through that causes agony. And as Jesus is there on that spot at the rock of agony, he's there on our behalf. You think about the emotional trauma that Jesus went through, that agony, and it goes even deeper, and the only word I can really think of to describe it is horror. That sense of agony turns to horror. The Bible talks about there, look in verse 36, that he was praying this, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. The word Abba is probably the most intimate name. It's probably the easiest name for a Hebrew child, a baby, to be able to speak. Was probably the first words a baby spoke just because of the mechanics of it. It is just the easiest word to say, Abba. But for them, that was the most intimate term. Our word daddy maybe is close, but that's how intimate it is. And Jesus is crying before his Father, Abba, Father. Now, before we go much further, think about what he's asking. Think about who it is that's asking. This is Jesus. This is the master of all the universe. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16, it says, for by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And then whenever you think about that Jesus is the one that speaks this, he is the master of the universe. He spoke this universe into existence. As you think about the one who asked this, he is master over the elements before him. You watch in his life, and he's in the boat, and there's a storm, and his disciples say, Master, we perish, don't you care? And it says that he got up and he spoke, and the wind and the waves ceased. And they said, what manner of man is this? Even the wind and the waves are subject to him. He could speak to the elements. This is master of the universe, master of the elements. This is master over life and death. Jesus was not looking into this cup with a fear of death. Jesus was master. The demons were subject to his authority. Time and time again, we're given the record where the demons would cry out, oh, Son of the Most High, what do we have to do with you? Were they acknowledged to it? Was they obeyed his voice? They obeyed his authority. This earth obeyed his authority. And even death itself. Jesus stood at the tomb of Lazarus and called him, Lazarus, come forth. Jesus interrupted a funeral procession. Jesus didn't go to funeral processions. He stopped them. And he raised the son of a widow and brought him back to life. He knelt down by Jairus' daughter, and he called her little girl, get up, arise. Get her something to eat because she's alive and she's okay. Jesus didn't look at this, and when it says that remove this cup in that fullest sense, that means to have the full experience of something. We might say to drink it completely. Not just to have a sip, not just to have a taste, but to have it completely. Jesus was looking at the full experience of what was there for him. So what was it that drove Jesus to the point to look into this full experience and recoil? What was it about this experience that caused Jesus to look into that cup and ask that he be relieved of this? I believe emotionally that we can tie some things. I think there was an emotional isolation that Jesus had a horror, had a dread of, because Jesus was a people person. Jesus loved people, and people loved Jesus. I mean, they came to Jesus by the thousands. Whenever you think about Jesus being among his people, even his enemies said that he was friends to sinners and to the tax collectors. Children flocked to Jesus, and Jesus gathered them in his arms, and he blessed them, and he loved on them. Jesus fed thousands of people. Jesus healed thousands of people. Thousands of people came to hear Jesus preach. But as we have walked through the book of Mark, have you noticed, and we've called attention to it, the closer we get to the cross, the fewer the crowd. The more that Jesus begins to talk about the demands of discipleship, then the less and the less that the crowd wants to follow after him. That's still true today. You can build a crowd, you can get a crowd to come, but you can't talk about discipleship. You can't talk about the cost of sin. You can't talk about surrender. You just talk about all the good and happy, and people want to come and hear that. But whenever you start looking at that we are called to take up our cross daily and follow after him, then the crowd leaves like shit, like rats on a ship, on a sinking ship. They just do not want to hear that. And now then we come to this night, and he is down to 12. One leaves to go betray him. We come to the garden, and there's 11. He goes a little bit farther, and now there's 3. And those 3 even fall asleep. And whenever the mob comes to arrest him, he is all alone. Whenever they take him through the roughness of the temple guard, he is all alone. When he stands there in the court of Caiaphas and he hears all the false witness that is given, the testimony that is given that are lies against him, he stands there all alone. Whenever he is taken before the mockery of Herod, he stands there all alone. When he stands before the arrogance of Pilate, he is there all alone. And when he is taken and beaten beyond recognition, and finally whenever he bears that cross down the Via Dolorosa, and he's taken down that way of suffering, and he's laying there on the cross, and whenever that guard puts his foot to his armpit and pulls his shoulders out of socket, and they take those spikes and they drive the nails through his hands and his feet, he is all alone. And when they hang him there on that cross, where he is in such a position where he has to pull against those shoulders and push against those nails, even to be able to exhale and to take in another breath, he is all alone. But it's at that moment when he can only breathe that he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he hangs there all alone. You may be here today, and they say this season of the year is for some the most depressing, most difficult time, and maybe even sitting in a crowd. You feel all alone, and you feel like no one understands. Jesus does. And when he looked into that cup, he knew that he would do this all alone. I think another reason why this is hard certainly is the physical. I think Jesus knew what he was going to endure. I think he completely understood. Now, I do believe that Jesus is completely God, but I believe he is completely man. John 1:14 says that he took on flesh and he tabernacled among us. And Jesus knew the full human experience. He drank this cup completely. He knew what it would mean. He knew the roughness of the guards. He knew what it meant when they struck him in the face. And the word that they use here when it talks about that they struck Jesus in the face, same word that we get the word pugilism from, with a closed fist, that they would strike him in the face. They would pull his hair, pull his beard from his face. Jesus looked at that cup, and he knew exactly what it was going to mean. He knew what the cat of nine tails and the lictor would do. He knew when that great loss of blood and the weakness that his body would feel, and as they placed the cross, and as he walked through the streets of Jerusalem, and he knew the horror of that physical suffering. And that is what partly, and sometimes, is it not true for you too? Sometimes the dread, looking ahead of some traumatic experience, sometimes the dread of looking ahead to that is worse than the experience itself. I think that is part of what Jesus sees in the cup. But I don't believe that's the real horror. I don't believe it's just that he was there alone. I don't believe it was just the physical part of it. That's the part we usually think about the cross. But what was it that caused Jesus to look into this full experience there in the garden, know what was coming, and to have that recoil to him and to say, Father, all things are possible with you, and I'd love for this not to happen. But Lord, not my will, but thine be done. What was that horrible thing? I think it was looking into the cup and seeing the full weight of the guilt of our sin. I believe that Jesus had walked through this life for 33 years and that he had been tempted in every way, but he had never allowed the righteousness of his soul to be touched by this world. He had been tempted in every way, but he had never sinned. And now then he looked into that cup. And let me describe what he saw. He saw everything you've ever done. He saw every deed that I have ever committed. He saw every sinful thought that I've ever allowed to pass through my mind. He has seen, and he looked and saw in that cup every ounce of guilt. He has seen the very expression of what we would hide from everybody else, of our disgrace and our shame. Jesus saw it all. And it caused him to look into that cup. 2 Corinthians 5:21, it says, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. In Christ, I've been made whole. But in the cross, Jesus took my sin. And I think that that is what Jesus endured. I think he had walked through that garbage dump. For those of you who have been, we have participated over the last few years with a mission down in Guatemala. And one of the things that we've done is to go and to help not only the church there and the start of a school there, but one of the things that actually started through some of the folks here, through Dr. Hill and Miss Regina and some others, is to be able to go and to help the indigenous folks there, the ones who are in that church, to help us and us help them, to go to the garbage dump and to do a food distribution and to be able to feed them. Matter of fact, as we look ahead to this next year, we're hoping to be able to continue that ministry so that every week there can be a ministry that goes to that garbage dump. I'm not talking about our landfill. If you've ever been to a landfill, that's bad enough. And even for those of us who can remember having a garbage dump, That's bad enough, but nothing in America, nothing in our country can compare to the garbage dumps in some of the third world country. And to think that there are people who are living there and that we can reach out to the least of these, our brothers. Now, we as Southern Baptists, we feed the hungry every day all over the world. Through the month of October, we give to the World Hunger Offering, and that we feed people in America and all over the world. But nothing is any worse than people who are living in a dump. Whenever you go, and if you go, I would encourage you, maybe you can't do construction, but you can go and you can help with that and participate in that. And now then the church there is taking the burden that they feel like they need to be reaching out to the people who are in the dump. But when you go, be prepared, because the first thing you're going to want to do is change your clothes whenever you leave. You just cannot get that stench out of your nose. If you can, you're going to want to take a bath. And to think that there are people, children, that are living there. Well, that's where we are. We're in the sin stench of our soul. And not just ours, but you think when Jesus looked, he saw every mass murderer and the guilt that was in that cup. He saw every member of ISIS and the hatred that was in that cup. He saw every liar and the filth of their thoughts. He saw the weight of every murderer and the guilt of that cup. And that is the horror that Jesus saw. I think he went through that experience, and there's one other emotion that it led him to. He went from agony to horror, and I believe that in Jesus he went from horror to peace. Today I think we can understand, and this is what Christmas ought to be about, what Thanksgiving ought to be about, is to know a peace, and it only comes in the way that Jesus gives it to us, and that is that he surrendered to the will of his Father. There in verse 36, he was crying, Abba, Father, and it means he just continued to pray this prayer. All things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. This wasn't a change in circumstances for Jesus. And for you to know peace, it's not going to mean a change necessarily of your circumstances. But it means that you're going to have a renewing of your mind, that what's important to you is what the Father wants. I think that is the secret. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. He says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, as the least you can do. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may know what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. It is, if you're going to have peace with God, it is because, if you're going to know the will of God, it is because God is going to do something to change your heart. And for a believer, for us to be able to have peace, even in the midst of horrors and agonies, it is that those circumstances, not the changing of circumstances, but because we want to know and do the will of God. And the only way to do that is the renewing of your mind. Today, right where you are, it's not enough just to look at this place of agony and think of all that Jesus went through. But it ought to be a call to us to kneel before God and pray this same prayer, yet not my will, but thine be done. God, renew in my mind that I want to sanctify you in my heart, that I want to be obedient to you. And then no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what cup you look into, that Jesus is there to give you the peace that only comes from God. And the Bible describes it as a peace that passes understanding. Luke gives us one other detail that the others don't, not just about the blood, the sweat of drops of blood, but in Luke 22 verses 42, this is how he describes what Jesus prays. Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. In verse 43, now an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. What did the angel do? I don't know. What did the angel say? I don't know. Maybe the angel said, look beyond this cup. Look beyond the cross and know that there is an empty tomb. Maybe the angel said, You're the perfect sacrifice. And only you can accomplish this. I don't know what the angel said. But I do know this, that from this point, that Jesus took the worst that the devil could offer and the worst that my flesh could offer, and he did the best. And Jesus squared his shoulders, and he walked straight to the cross. And then Jesus squared his shoulders, and he walked right out of a tomb. I don't know what the angel said. I don't know what the angel did. But I know I've been brushed by an angel's wing. I know that God has given me peace because I know a peace with God. And that came only because of what Jesus endured. It is only by placing my faith and my trust in the finished work of Christ and what he has done that I could ever know peace with God. Now then I know peace with God, I want to be able to experience and to share the peace of God. If you're here today and you've never trusted Jesus in a personal relationship, Jesus went through this for you. He died on the cross for you. And here today, you can have peace with God by right where you are, admitting your sin, repenting of your sin, turning to Christ, and calling upon the name of Jesus.